Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was one of those nights where the winter wind howled like an animal outside, and the snow fell so thickly you couldn't see anything beyond the porch light. I had been looking forward to the weekend alone at home for a while. My parents were away for a wedding, and I had the house to myself. The thought of a few quiet nights to myself sounded peaceful. I hadn't expected the storm to get as bad as it did. By the time night fell, the wind had picked up. The sky was completely black, and the only light came from the occasional flicker of street lamps that barely pierced through the snow. I was curled up on the couch, watching an old horror movie, sipping on hot cocoa, and enjoying the silence. The fire in the fireplace crackled, and I could hear the occasional snow hitting the windows. But then, just after the movie ended, I heard something that made my heart stop. There was a knock at the door. It wasn't the kind of knock you'd expect from a salesman or someone trying to sell you something. It was a slow, deliberate knock, as though someone was tapping their knuckles lightly against the wood. The kind of knock that made you pause, made you wonder if you were hearing things. I sat still, listening to the wind howl outside. My parents had made it clear they'd be away for the whole weekend. I was alone, with no reason to expect anyone. Still, I got up cautiously and walked toward the door. There was a faint glow from the porch light, but the snow was so heavy that it made it hard to see anything outside. I peered through the peephole, but the lens was fogged over with condensation. I couldn't see a thing. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. "Is someone there?" There was no response. For a moment, I thought about opening the door, but a feeling of dread crawled up my spine. Instead, I checked the locks. The front door was double locked. I turned off the porch light and retreated back into the living room. I sat there staring at the door, my pulse still racing. It was likely a prank, or maybe someone in need of help. But with the storm as bad as it was, no one could have made it this far into the neighborhood. And anyway, I hadn't heard anyone's car. After a while, I tried to put it out of my mind, figuring that the wind or something else had made me paranoid. I didn't think about it again until I heard it again, just as I was settling back into the couch, the same knock, this time louder. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents. "Did you guys get home early? Someone is knocking on the door." My hands trembled as I waited for a reply. The text bubble appeared as I held my breath. "We're still at the wedding. Why?" That was when I froze. My parents were miles away, and I was the only one in the house. I stood up quickly, my phone slipping from my hand as I made my way to the door. I checked the locks again, double-checking everything. My mind was racing. Should I call the police? The knocking continued in slow intervals. Whoever it was, they didn't sound like they were in a hurry. They didn't seem to care that no one was responding. They just kept knocking. I walked to the back window and carefully peeked through the blinds. The outside world was nothing but a swirling mass of white. The streetlights cast faint, eerie glows across the snow, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the snow, no figure standing on the porch. It was as if the person had disappeared into the storm, leaving no trace. I debated whether to call the police, but I hesitated. If it was just someone lost in the snow, then it was my responsibility to help. But there was something about the way the knocking had started, how it felt deliberate, cold, unnatural. It was hard to shake the feeling that I wasn't dealing with a normal situation. I grabbed a kitchen knife, trying to steady my hands as I approached the door again. The storm raged outside, louder now, the wind howling like a living thing. Then, as I stood there listening, I heard something. Soft, almost imperceptible. It was a shuffle, a dragging sound coming from the hall upstairs. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone enter the house. I had locked all the doors, and yet there was someone moving upstairs. I stepped back from the door, my breath shallow as I realized what had happened. The knocking wasn't the worst of it. There was something in the house. In the house. It was upstairs, and it wasn't just the storm playing tricks on my mind. It was real. I ran upstairs quickly, the house eerily quiet except for the sound of the wind slamming against the windows. My heart was pounding, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I passed by the rooms. The upstairs hall was dark, the only light coming from a dim lamp in my bedroom. The dragging sound had stopped. I checked my parents' room, my own, and then the bathroom. There was no sign of anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned back toward the staircase, my mind racing. What if someone had been hiding in the house the whole time? My feet moved toward the attic door, but I paused. I couldn't go up there, not with this feeling pressing down on me. I grabbed my phone and texted my parents again. "Someone is definitely in the house. Please come home." There was no response. The storm had likely knocked out the cell signal. That was when the front door opened. Slowly, quietly, my breath caught in my throat. The door opened just wide enough for a figure to slip inside. The storm whistled through the crack, but no one made a sound. I backed up, my back hitting the wall. My fingers tightened around the phone, still no response from my parents. I had to do something. I rushed to the back door, but I saw no one outside. There were no car headlights, no footprints in the snow. But the back door was open, just a crack, enough to let the storm in. I ran back to the front of the house, trying to calm myself. The noise from upstairs had stopped. It was silent now, too silent. That's when I heard something else, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. I was no longer alone. I sprinted out the back door, into the snow, feeling the freezing wind hit my face as I ran to the neighbor's house. I didn't stop until I was inside, heart hammering in my chest. I told my neighbor what had happened, but when the police arrived, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no one hiding in the house, no strange prints in the snow. They suggested I was just rattled by the storm, but I knew what I'd heard. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed at the neighbor's house, and the next day, I had the locks changed. I don't know who was knocking at my door or what was moving through the house, but to this day, I still wonder. Sometimes in the dead of winter, I hear that same knock in my head, and I can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I was 19 years old, home alone for the weekend while my parents went to a family reunion across the state. The snow had started falling heavily around noon, and by evening, the world outside was coated in white. The wind howled through the trees, shaking the windows of our old farmhouse. It was the kind of storm that made you want to curl up under a blanket, sip hot cocoa, and forget about everything else. I had been looking forward to the solitude, even though I'd never really been alone for a night before. The thought of having the whole house to myself was exciting at first, but as the hours passed and the storm grew stronger, a sense of unease began to settle over me. I tried to shake it off, but the sound of the wind was starting to sound different, like it was more than just a storm. It sounded almost like voices. At around 10 p.m., the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. I had been watching TV for a while and had just turned it off when I heard the first knock at the door. It was soft at first, like someone gently tapping on the wood, but it was distinct enough to pull me out of my thoughts. I froze, listening. The knock came again, this time a bit louder, more deliberate. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but something told me it wasn't. I got up slowly and walked to the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was the blinding white of the snowstorm outside. No one was there. My heart started to race, and I turned the deadbolt on the door just to be sure. Maybe it was someone passing through the neighborhood who needed help, but I had a bad feeling about it. I sat back down on the couch, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. I had convinced myself it was just my imagination when the knock came again, even louder than before. This time it was followed by a strange scraping sound, like something or someone was dragging across the porch. I stood up in a panic, my mind racing. I hadn't heard any car pull into the driveway, and there was no way anyone could be out there in the storm without being completely soaked from the snow. I grabbed my phone, wanting to call my parents, but I realized I couldn't. There was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. My instincts told me something wasn't right. I was in a remote area, and it was far too dangerous for anyone to be out in this kind of weather, especially at this hour. I quickly checked all the windows and doors, ensuring everything was locked. The house was dark except for the dim light from the living room lamp. My thoughts raced. Maybe it was a prank, but who would come all the way out here just for that? Then there was a noise from upstairs. It was faint at first, a small creak of floorboards as though someone had walked across the hall. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I was alone. I had locked all the doors and no one had entered. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the house settling in the cold. But then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate step, followed by the unmistakable sound of something brushing against the walls. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was no one in the house. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and I definitely hadn't seen anyone in the yard. My pulse quickened, and I found myself frozen in place, staring at the dark hallway leading upstairs. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept cautiously toward the staircase. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was upstairs. As I reached the foot of the stairs, the creaking sound came again, followed by the scraping sound I had heard earlier. Someone was moving upstairs. But who? I held my breath, stepping closer to the stairs. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? No, I couldn't. There was no signal. The only option was to confront whoever or whatever was in my house. With shaky hands, I climbed the stairs slowly. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, the creaking floorboards a constant reminder that something was wrong. I reached the top and listened carefully. The house was dead silent, save for the soft howling of the wind outside. I slowly made my way to the first room, my flashlight illuminating the dark hallway. I pushed open the door to my parents' bedroom. Empty. Nothing. I checked every room upstairs, but there was no sign of anyone, just an eerie silence. But when I entered the bathroom at the far end of the hall, my heart stopped. The window was wide open. It had been closed earlier when I had checked. I quickly shut the window, my mind racing. There was no way the wind could have opened it. But what, had been up here? I headed back downstairs, my thoughts running wild. It had to have been a prank, right? Someone had snuck in through the window? But I had checked everything. There was no way. Just then, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window in the living room. I froze. There was no way. I slowly approached the window, peeking through the blinds. The snowstorm outside was so thick, I couldn't see anything beyond the first few feet. But then a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. He was standing just outside the window, staring in at me. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the window quickly, trying to stay out of sight. The man didn't move. He just stood there, unmoving, staring into the house. I grabbed my phone, but there was still no signal. The house was completely isolated, and no one could hear me if I screamed. I backed away from the window slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what to do. I could hear the man's breath now, shallow and slow, but there was no way I was going to confront him. I turned off the lights and moved to the back of the house, hoping to get to the back door. But as I did, I heard something from the front. The door. It creaked open. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted for the back door, wrenching it open and running into the snow without a second thought. My feet sank deep into the snow as I sprinted to the neighbor's house, barely able to see through the thick storm. I pounded on their door, hysterical. When they let me in, I told them everything, what had happened, what I had seen. But when the police arrived, the house was empty. There were no footprints in the snow. The doors were locked, and the window upstairs had been closed again. I didn't sleep that night. The storm raged on, and I stayed with the neighbors until my parents came home the next day. They were skeptical of my story, of course. They thought I had been imagining things in the dark, that I had let the storm get to my head. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. There had been someone or something there. To this day, I can't explain it. There are still nights when the wind howls just right, and I feel that same sense of dread that I felt that night. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snow had been falling all afternoon, slowly at first, then heavier as the hours passed. By the time Claire settled into her living room, the world outside had transformed into a thick, white blanket of cold. The wind howled and rattled the windows, sending the occasional flurry of snowflakes swirling into the edges of the house. She wasn't used to being alone at night, especially in winter. Claire's parents had gone to a business conference, and her older brother had taken the opportunity to visit a friend. That left her in the big old house by herself, with only the wind for company. Normally, she loved the peace and quiet. It gave her a chance to relax, catch up on her books, or watch some movies. But tonight, something felt different. She couldn't explain it, but she felt uneasy. It wasn't that she thought anyone would break in. The house was remote, tucked into the woods several miles from the nearest neighbor. The front door was always locked, the windows too high for anyone to climb into. Even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thought. She pulled her blanket around her and turned on the TV, finding comfort in the familiar flickering light of a movie. Still, her thoughts kept drifting back to the sounds of the wind. It wasn't just the howling outside that unsettled her. It was the way the house creaked in the storm, the way the shadows seemed to shift and stretch in the corners of her vision. Half an hour passed, then another, as Claire tried to focus on the movie. Her eyes grew heavy, but before she could drift off, she heard something. A sound. A soft thump from somewhere in the house. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It came again, closer this time, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. She sat up straighter, listening. Nothing. The house was still. Claire stood up, feeling the weight of the silence settle around her. The house felt colder all of a sudden. She glanced around the room, her eyes searching every corner, every shadow. The sound had come from the kitchen. She was sure of it. Reluctantly, Claire made her way toward the kitchen. She turned on the lights, the bright glow flooding the room. The kitchen was empty, everything in its place. The door to the pantry was shut, the refrigerator humming softly. Still, her unease remained, and she found herself checking the back door just to be certain. It was locked, as it should be. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. It was probably nothing. Just the house settling in the cold, or a branch scraping against the window. The feeling didn't go away. She went back to the living room and tried to distract herself with her phone. She texted her mom, asking how the conference was going. She got a reply a few minutes later. "Everything's great, sweetheart. I'll call you later. Stay safe." She put the phone down, glancing nervously toward the kitchen again. The house felt far too quiet, too still. She tried to focus back on the movie, but the sense of being watched never left. She could almost feel eyes on her, as if someone were standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. She looked out the window toward the woods. It was dark, and the snow had begun to fall even harder. The trees were almost indistinguishable from the white expanse of the yard. No movement, nothing that would explain the chill creeping up her spine. The thumping noise came again. It was louder this time, and Claire felt a jolt of fear shoot through her. It was coming from upstairs. She stood up, trembling slightly, and moved cautiously toward the stairs. Her breath was shallow, and her footsteps were soft as she ascended, one step at a time. As she reached the top, the noise stopped. Claire paused, listening. Nothing. She turned down the hallway and toward the first bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. It was her parents' room, the one they always kept locked when they weren't home. She didn't go inside often, and certainly not at night. But tonight, there was no ignoring the pull of curiosity. The air inside the room was colder, as if the heat hadn't reached this far. She shivered as she stepped into the room. It was dark, and the moonlight filtered in from the window, casting long shadows across the floor. The bed was made, the curtains drawn tight. Everything seemed in order. Claire exhaled, trying to calm herself. She turned to leave when she noticed something on the floor near the closet. It was a shoe, one of her mom's. A black, leather flat, positioned oddly as if it had been thrown carelessly across the room. She picked it up, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. It was out of place. Had someone been in here? The thought gripped her with sudden force. Her heart started to race. She backed away slowly, almost instinctively. The house was empty. She was sure of it. But then, why was this shoe here? She turned to leave, but heard something behind her. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. The floorboards creaked beneath the weight. Claire's breath caught in her throat. There was someone else in the house. She ran down the stairs as fast as she could, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't. Her only thought was getting out of the house. The front door. She reached the door, yanked it open, and stepped outside into the cold night air. The snow hit her like a slap, sharp and biting. She ran, her boots sinking into the deep drifts as she bolted toward the road. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent, like it was holding its breath. She didn't look back. Halfway down the road, Claire's phone buzzed. She stopped, her breath coming in sharp gasps, and pulled it out of her pocket. It was a message from her brother. "Hey, I just got back to town. Everything good at home?" Claire's fingers shook as she typed a response. Her voice trembled in the message. "I don't know. There's someone in the house. I think they're still here." She hit send, then started running again, the cold cutting through her clothes, her body screaming for warmth. The wind howled around her, carrying with it the sound of the house, a faint, distant thump, like something heavy being dragged along the floor. It was getting closer. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The winter night was bitterly cold. The kind of cold that seeped through every crack in the house, no matter how high the heat was turned up. I had just turned 20 and had been looking forward to this weekend alone. My parents had gone to visit my aunt in another state, and I had declined to go, craving some peace and quiet to catch up on my studies and relax. The snowstorm that had started earlier in the afternoon had only added to the solitude. The house felt different that evening. The snow piled against the windows, muffling every sound, leaving the world eerily silent. The only noises were the faint hum of the furnace and the occasional creak of the old wood under the pressure of the wind. I was curled up on the couch with a blanket, scrolling through my phone while a movie played in the background. At first, it was easy to ignore the sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere outside. I assumed it was a loose branch hitting the house. But as the minutes passed, the sound became harder to ignore. It was too deliberate, too patterned. 3 soft taps, then silence. 3 more taps, and then silence again. I paused the movie and sat up, listening intently. The wind howled against the house, but the tapping persisted. It sounded like it was coming from the front door. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced at the clock. It was 9:43 p.m. Who would be outside in a storm like this? I grabbed my phone and walked to the door, my socks sliding slightly on the wooden floor. The entryway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the porch light. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see a neighbor in need, or maybe someone lost in the storm. There was no one there. My breath fogged up the cold glass as I stared into the swirling snow. I waited, holding my breath, but the porch was empty. I double-checked the locks and stepped back, my unease growing. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but something about the sound stuck with me. It wasn't random like the branches scratching against the house or the groan of the storm. It had a rhythm, a purpose. I returned to the couch, forcing myself to focus on the movie. For a while, the tapping stopped, and I began to relax, convincing myself it had been nothing. Then it started again, louder this time. The taps came from the window in the living room, the one just behind me. My stomach twisted as I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The curtains were drawn and I couldn't see outside, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was tapping on the glass. I stood frozen for a moment, gripping my phone tightly. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me, but my body screamed at me to move. I grabbed the edge of the curtain and yanked it aside. There was nothing there, just the snow blowing sideways in the wind. I let the curtain fall back into place, my breathing shallow. My hands were trembling as I checked my phone. No signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. I set it down and tried to steady myself, pacing back and forth in the living room. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Faint but distinct coming from upstairs. My blood ran cold. The house was locked. I had checked all the doors and windows earlier. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy glass vase from the coffee table, and crept toward the staircase. The house was silent, except for the sound of my breathing and the occasional groan of the wind outside. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the darkness. The hallway light was off, leaving the upstairs in shadows. I strained to hear, but the footsteps had stopped. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. My words felt ridiculous as soon as they left my mouth. No one would answer. Or worse, someone might. I waited, gripping the vase tightly, but there was no response. Summoning what little courage I had, I slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The air felt heavier up there, colder somehow, as if the storm had found its way inside. I checked each room methodically, my heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. My parents' bedroom was empty, so was mine. The bathroom door was open, and the room was dark and still. Finally, I reached the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was closed, which was strange. I distinctly remembered leaving it open earlier. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct told me to turn around, to run back downstairs, to leave the house entirely. But I had to know. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was empty, the bed was undisturbed, the curtains drawn tightly over the windows. There was no sign of anyone. But just as I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The closet door was slightly ajar. I stared at it, my chest tightening. It had been closed earlier. I was sure of it. I stepped closer, my palms sweaty, gripping the vase like it was a lifeline. With a shaking hand, I reached out and pulled the closet door open. Nothing. Just rows of hanging clothes and a few storage boxes on the floor. I let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at myself. I was being ridiculous. There was no one here. It was just my imagination running wild, fueled by the storm and too many horror movies. I closed the closet door and left the room, heading back downstairs. I just reached the bottom step when I heard it again, the tapping. This time, it was coming from the kitchen window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The vase felt heavy in my hand as I moved slowly toward the kitchen, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping was louder now, more insistent. I reached the window and hesitated, my fingers hovering over the edge of the curtain. I yanked it open, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a dark shape standing just beyond the glass. But when I blinked, it was gone. The yard was empty, the snow undisturbed. I locked the window and drew the curtains tightly. My heart was racing and my mind was spinning. I couldn't explain what I was hearing, what I was seeing or not seeing. The house felt wrong, like it wasn't mine anymore. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my coat and boots, determined to head to the neighbor's house down the road. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard it, a creak from upstairs. The footsteps were back. This time, I didn't stop to investigate. I bolted out the front door into the storm. The snow was blinding, the wind cutting through my coat like a knife. But I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, slipping and stumbling until I reached the neighbor's house. They let me in, their faces filled with concern as I told them what had happened. The police came an hour later, but they found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry. The house was empty, silent, just as I had left it. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. The memories still haunt me, the tapping, the footsteps, the fleeting shadow in the window. I've never stayed home alone during a storm since then. Whatever was in the house that night, I'm just glad I left when I did. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the first real snowstorm of the year. The flakes had started falling in the early afternoon, light at first, but by nightfall the ground was buried under a thick white blanket. Olivia stared out the living room window of her family's old farmhouse, watching as the wind whipped through the trees and scattered snow in swirling patterns. Her parents had left earlier in the day to attend a holiday party at a friend's house, insisting it wasn't far enough to cancel despite the weather. Olivia, a college freshman on winter break, had opted to stay home. She liked the idea of a quiet night to herself, hot chocolate, a good book, and her favorite blanket. The isolation didn't bother her. Their house was miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by open fields and dense woods. She'd grown up here and was used to the solitude. But tonight, the quiet felt different. It pressed in around her, amplifying every creak of the house and every howl of the wind. She tried to focus on her book, curling up on the couch with the glow of the fireplace to keep her company. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. The storm made the house groan more than usual, and the flickering shadows from the fire played tricks on her eyes. But when she heard the first sound, a faint thump from somewhere upstairs, her heart skipped a beat. She froze, listening intently. The noise didn't come again, and she told herself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had knocked something over. Maybe it was an old pipe expanding in the cold. She shook her head and turned back to her book, determined to ignore the creeping unease. Minutes passed, then another sound, a slow, deliberate creak like a footstep on the old wooden floorboards. It was faint, but unmistakable. Olivia sat up, her pulse quickening. The sound had definitely come from upstairs. She glanced toward the staircase at the far end of the living room, the darkness at the top seeming deeper than it should have been. The farmhouse was old, and the second floor had always felt a little eerie at night. But she knew she was alone. Her parents wouldn't be back until late, and no one else had a key. Her phone was on the coffee table. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she checked for any missed calls or texts. Nothing. The storm had knocked out their Wi-Fi earlier, so there was no way to check her security cameras remotely. Deciding she was overreacting, Olivia grabbed the heavy fireplace poker and headed toward the staircase. If there was something making noise up there, she needed to know. She turned on the hallway light, the weak bulb casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. With each step, the wooden stairs groaned beneath her weight, the sound louder than she remembered. When she reached the top, the hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors. The air felt colder up here, and the faint smell of dust lingered. Her parents' bedroom was at the far end, her own room to the left, and a guest room to the right. She checked each door, peering inside one by one. Everything was as it should be, neatly made beds, furniture undisturbed. But as she turned back toward the staircase, she noticed something odd. The door to the attic was slightly ajar. It was just a crawl space used for storing holiday decorations and old boxes, and she was certain it had been shut the last time she'd seen it. Her grip on the poker tightened as she approached the attic door. The small pull-string light dangled from the ceiling, swaying gently in the draft. Olivia hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. Then, summoning her courage, she reached for the string and pulled. The light flickered on, casting a dim yellow glow up into the cramped space. She leaned in cautiously, scanning the rows of stacked boxes and dusty ornaments. The attic was empty, silent, except for the faint whistling of the wind outside. Relief washed over her, but only for a moment. As she turned to leave, a soft sound drifted down from behind her. A whisper. It was barely audible, but the tone was unmistakable. A low, rasping voice speaking words she couldn't understand. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest, but the attic was still empty. The whispering stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. She backed away, closing the door firmly behind her and locking it. Downstairs, she tried to calm herself. It had to be her imagination. Maybe the storm was messing with her senses, amplifying normal noises into something sinister. She forced herself to sit down and turn on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out her nerves. The power flickered once, then went out entirely. The room plunged into darkness, and the only light came from the dying embers of the fire. Olivia's breath quickened as she fumbled for her phone. She turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the windows, where the storm continued to rage outside. Snow piled high against the glass, the wind battering the house with relentless force. Then she heard it, a knock at the front door. It was faint at first, almost lost in the howl of the wind. But it came again, louder this time, deliberate and insistent. Olivia's stomach twisted. No one should be out here, not in this weather. Her parents weren't due back for hours, and they would have texted if they'd returned early. She crept toward the door, her heart racing, and peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty. The knock came again, but it wasn't from the front door this time. It was coming from the back. She froze, panic taking hold. How could someone have moved to the back door so quickly without her hearing footsteps in the snow? She edged toward the kitchen where the back door was located and peered out the small window beside it. Again, no one was there. Her phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. She looked down to see a text message from an unknown number. The message was short. "Are you alone?" Her blood ran cold. She didn't respond. Another message came through a moment later. "I'm inside." The phone slipped from her trembling hands, clattering to the floor. Olivia backed away, gripping the fireplace poker tightly. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of prank? But the house felt different now, charged with an oppressive energy that made her skin crawl. A creak sounded behind her. She whipped around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the room was empty. The sound came again, closer this time, like footsteps on the old wooden floor. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, moving toward her from the direction of the stairs. She bolted for the front door, yanking it open and running out into the storm. The snow stung her face, and the icy wind bit at her skin, but she didn't stop. She ran blindly toward the woods, her only thought to get as far from the house as possible. Behind her, the farmhouse stood in darkness, its windows like empty eyes staring into the night. And then, faintly, from somewhere deep within the house came the sound of laughter. Story: the end.
Story number 6.
It was a frigid winter night, and the snowstorm outside seemed relentless. The wind howled, rattling the windows of my family's old farmhouse. My parents had left for a weekend trip to visit my grandmother, leaving me alone for the first time in the house. At 22, I wasn't exactly scared to be on my own, but something about the stormy night made everything feel different, eerier somehow. The house was silent, except for the occasional groan of the wooden floors and the hum of the heater struggling to combat the cold. I had planned to spend the evening catching up on reading, but the storm had knocked out the power just after sundown. With no internet or lights, I had lit a few candles and settled into the living room with a heavy blanket and my flashlight. At first, I relished the quiet. The storm outside made the inside of the house feel cozy, and I let myself relax, flipping through a book by candlelight. But then, sometime around 9 p.m., I heard it, a faint, distant knock. I froze, my ears straining to hear over the howling wind. It was so faint that I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the wind throwing snow against the side of the house. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. My heart started racing. No one should be out in this storm. Our nearest neighbors lived half a mile away, and the snow was already knee-deep. Who could possibly be at the door in weather like this? I grabbed my flashlight and approached the front door cautiously. The old wooden floors creaked under my feet, each step sounding unnaturally loud. When I reached the door, I peered through the peephole, my breath fogging the cold glass. Nothing. The porch was empty. The snow-covered yard stretched out into the darkness, untouched. No footprints. No sign of anyone. I hesitated, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Shaking my head, I locked the deadbolt and stepped back. It had to be the storm playing tricks on me. Maybe a branch had hit the door. I returned to the living room, trying to shake off the unease. I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I told myself. There was no one out there. Then I heard it again. This time, the sound came from the back of the house. 3 sharp knocks on the kitchen door. My stomach dropped. I hadn't imagined it. Someone was knocking, and they had moved to the other side of the house. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I made my way to the kitchen. The room was pitch black, except for the faint glow of the candle I had left burning on the counter. The back door had a small window, but the curtain was drawn. I stood frozen, listening. The knocking came again, loud and deliberate. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I inched closer to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I was too scared to pull back the curtain and look. Instead, I waited, barely breathing, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. The knocking stopped. I listened for footsteps, for any sound of movement outside, but there was only the wind. After what felt like an eternity, I finally gathered the courage to peek out the window. Slowly, I lifted the curtain, my flashlight casting a faint glow onto the snow-covered porch. There was no one there. Just like the front door, the snow was undisturbed. No footprints. Nothing. I locked the door and backed away, my mind racing. Maybe I was hearing things. Maybe the storm was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I decided to check all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. As I moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. The creaking of the house suddenly felt like footsteps, and the wind outside sounded almost like whispers. When I reached the living room again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door, the one I had locked minutes ago, was slightly ajar. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The lock was still engaged, but the door was open just a crack, enough to let in a sliver of freezing air. Slowly, I approached it, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I pushed the door shut and locked it again, my hands shaking. I backed away, scanning the room with my flashlight. I didn't see anything, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers. Panic set in as I realized how isolated I was. No one could hear me if I screamed. No one could come to help. That's when I heard the sound. It wasn't knocking this time. It was a soft, deliberate creak, like someone stepping on the old wooden stairs. I froze, staring toward the staircase that led to the second floor. My flashlight beam wavered as I pointed it at the darkened hallway. The sound came again, another creak, closer this time. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Instead, I stood there, paralyzed, listening as the slow, deliberate footsteps descended the stairs. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a faint, raspy voice came from the darkness. "You shouldn't have stayed alone." That was all I needed to hear. I dropped the flashlight and bolted for the front door, yanking it open and running out into the storm without looking back. The icy wind cut through me, and the snow was blinding, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could toward the neighbor's house down the road. When I finally reached their front porch, I was shaking so badly I could barely knock. They let me in, their faces full of concern as I babbled about what had happened. They called the police, but when they arrived, the house was empty. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow, nothing to indicate anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Something was in that house with me that night. Something that didn't leave footprints. I never stayed home alone again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The snowstorm had arrived earlier than predicted, blanketing the quiet neighborhood in a suffocating stillness. Emma sat curled up on the couch in her family's small home at the edge of the woods, the faint glow of the television her only companion. Her parents were out for the evening at a holiday dinner across town, leaving her to enjoy a rare evening of solitude. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows in their frames, and she pulled the fleece blanket tighter around her shoulders. It wasn't the first time she'd been home alone, but something about the storm and the empty house felt different tonight. The silence between the gusts of wind seemed to stretch too long, as if the world was holding its breath. Emma had planned a cozy night, a stack of her favorite horror movies, hot cocoa, and maybe a late-night snack raid. She'd made it halfway through her second film when she heard it, a faint knock. At first, she thought it was part of the movie, some background sound effect meant to set the tone. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakable and coming from her front door. Her heart gave a small leap. She paused the movie and listened, the muffled sound of the storm outside filling the quiet. The knock came again, deliberate and sharp. It was strange. No one ever came by this late, especially not in weather like this. She checked her phone. No messages, no missed calls. Probably just a neighbor, she muttered to herself, though she wasn't sure who would brave the snowstorm just to pay a visit. She stood and walked to the front door, her socked feet silent on the hardwood floor. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing. The porch was empty, the snow piled high against the railing. A nervous laugh escaped her. It must have been her imagination, or maybe the wind had knocked something loose. She double-checked the lock and returned to the couch, trying to shake off the creeping unease. But as she sat down, there it was again. 3 deliberate knocks, this time coming from the side door in the kitchen. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She froze, her eyes darting toward the kitchen as her mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe someone had gotten turned around in the storm and was looking for shelter? Maybe her parents had sent a friend to check on her? Gripping her phone tightly, she crept toward the kitchen, her footsteps hesitant. The side door had a small, frosted glass pane, but the swirling snow outside made it impossible to see anything clearly. Her fingers hovered over the door handle as she hesitated, her pulse quickening. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" No answer, only the wind and the faint groan of the house settling in the cold. Her nerves stretched thin, she backed away from the door, returning to the living room and locking every door along the way. She texted her parents, "Hey, is everything okay? Did you send someone to check on me?" She waited, staring at her phone, but the message sat unread. As she was about to call, another sound came. Not a knock this time, but the faint creak of footsteps on the wooden porch outside the back door. Emma's chest tightened, and she stood frozen in place, straining to hear. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace and dialed her dad's number, pressing the phone to her ear. The call went straight to voicemail. Her stomach twisted as the footsteps stopped. Silence, the kind that made her skin crawl. A low, muffled tapping began at the window in the living room. Emma spun toward it, the poker clutched tightly in her hand. Through the thin curtains, she could see a faint outline, tall and motionless, standing just outside the glass. Her breath hitched, and she stumbled back, her hands trembling. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'll call the police." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, shadowy and indistinct in the swirling snow. Emma's mind raced. She turned off the lights in the living room, plunging the house into near darkness. Maybe if they thought no one was home, they'd leave. She crouched behind the couch, clutching her phone and dialing 911 with shaking hands. The operator picked up, her calm voice a small comfort in the storm of panic swirling around Emma. "There's someone outside my house," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "They've been knocking on the doors and windows that I think they're trying to get in." The operator asked for her address and assured her that help was on the way. "Stay on the line with me," she said. "Can you see the person now?" Emma peeked over the edge of the couch, her eyes darting to the window. The figure was gone. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. A loud crash echoed through the house, coming from the back door. "They're trying to break in." Emma hissed into the phone. "Find a safe place to hide," the operator instructed. "Lock yourself in a room and stay quiet. Officers are on their way." Emma bolted for the stairs, her legs trembling as she climbed to the second floor. She locked herself in the bathroom, sliding the bolt into place and wedging a chair under the handle for good measure. The tiny room felt claustrophobic, but at least it was secure. She sat in the corner, clutching the fireplace poker in one hand and her phone in the other, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The operator stayed on the line, her voice steady and reassuring. "You're doing great. Stay calm. The police should be there any minute." Emma nodded, even though she knew the woman couldn't see her. She strained to listen for any sound from downstairs, but the house had gone eerily silent again. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, every creak and groan of the house setting her nerves on edge. Then she heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping on the bathroom door. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't heard any footsteps on the stairs, no sign that anyone had made their way up. The tapping came again, rhythmic and slow, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was toying with her. Emma pressed the phone tightly to her ear, her voice barely a whisper. "They're outside the door." "Stay quiet," the operator said firmly. "Help is almost there." The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the sound of heavy, shuffling footsteps retreated down the hall, growing fainter with each step. Emma waited, her heart pounding in her chest, until she heard the distant wail of sirens cutting through the storm. The red and blue lights flashing outside the house were the most beautiful thing Emma had ever seen. She stayed locked in the bathroom until she heard the police calling out for her, their voices calm and authoritative. She ran downstairs to find 2 officers standing in the living room, their boots tracking snow onto the rug. They searched the house and the surrounding property but found no sign of anyone. The snow outside had been disturbed near the doors and windows, but the footprints disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the storm. Whoever had been there was gone. Emma's parents came rushing home, apologizing profusely for leaving her alone. The police assured them they'd patrol the area, but no one could explain who or what had been outside the house that night. Emma never stayed home alone again. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
The winter wind howled through the cracks in the old farmhouse. sending a chill through 18-year-old Lily as she adjusted the thick blanket wrapped around her. The snowstorm had started hours earlier, cutting the house off from the world. The roads were buried under a thick layer of snow, and even the closest neighbor, half a mile away, was unreachable. Her parents had left for a weekend trip, trusting Lily to watch the house and feed their 2 cats, Whiskers and Shadow. At first, the idea of being home alone had thrilled her. She could binge watch her favorite shows, eat junk food, and stay up as late as she wanted. But as the hours ticked by and the storm grew fiercer, the isolation began to sink in. The occasional creak of the house and the moaning of the wind made her glance over her shoulder more than once. It was just past midnight when she heard the first sound. A dull thud, like something heavy falling, came from the direction of the kitchen. She paused her movie, listening intently. Whiskers and Shadow were curled up together on the armchair near the fireplace, fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. Probably just the wind, she muttered, trying to convince herself. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, hesitating before heading toward the kitchen. The house felt colder as she stepped into the darkened hallway. The storm outside was relentless, the wind rattling the windows as snow piled up against them. When she reached the kitchen, she saw nothing out of place. The pots and pans hanging from the rack above the island were still, and the chairs were neatly tucked under the table. But then she noticed the back door. It was slightly ajar, snow drifting in and melting on the tiled floor. Lily's stomach twisted. She was sure she had locked it earlier. She stepped closer, her hand shaking as she pushed the door shut and locked it. Her breath fogged in the icy air, and she quickly checked to make sure all the other windows and doors were secure. Everything else seemed fine. Still, the unease lingered. She returned to the living room, glancing at the cats. They were still asleep, completely undisturbed. "See? You're freaking out over nothing," she whispered to herself. But then the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of her phone. The hum of the heater stopped, and the only sound was the relentless wind outside. Lily's heart raced as she fumbled to find the flashlight her dad always kept in the drawer by the fireplace. She clicked it on, the beam cutting through the gloom. She checked her phone. No service. The storm must have knocked out the cell tower, too. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. It wasn't the first time the power had gone out during a storm, and it wouldn't be the last. As she stood in the living room, deciding what to do next, she heard it again, the thud. This time, it was louder, coming from upstairs. Her grip on the flashlight tightened. The cats were awake now, their ears perked up and eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. She immediately regretted it. What if someone answered? There was no response. Gathering her courage, Lily made her way to the staircase, her footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. The upstairs hallway stretched out before her, the shadows seeming to move with the flickering beam of her flashlight. Her parents' room was at the end of the hall, and the door was slightly open. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Slowly, she pushed the door open with the toe of her slipper and shone the flashlight inside. The room was empty, just as they had left it. The bed was neatly made, and nothing seemed out of place. She exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over her. But as she turned to leave, the floorboard creaked behind her. Lily froze. Her flashlight beam shook as she turned back toward the source of the sound. The room was still empty, but the closet door, usually closed, was now slightly ajar. Her mouth went dry. She stared at the gap in the door, her mind racing. Had it been open before? She couldn't remember. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. With one swift motion, she yanked the door open. The closet was empty, just rows of her parents' clothes and a few old boxes stacked on the floor. She let out a nervous laugh, feeling foolish for letting her imagination get the better of her. She was about to close the door when she noticed something odd. A faint set of wet footprints leading from the closet to the bedroom door. Her heart nearly stopped. The prints weren't hers. They were too large, and she hadn't been outside. She followed them with the flashlight, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The prints led out into the hallway and stopped abruptly at the top of the stairs. Lily's mind reeled. There was no one in the hallway, no sign of movement. She crept back downstairs, her ears straining for any sound over the storm outside. The living room felt colder than before, the fire in the hearth barely flickering. And then she saw it. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in and coating the floor. The footprints led from the door to the middle of the room and stopped. Lily's blood ran cold. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting around the room. She grabbed her phone, dialing 911, even though she knew there was no service. The call failed, and her screen went dark as her phone battery died. A soft creak came from behind her. She spun around, the flashlight shaking in her hand, but there was nothing there. The cats hissed suddenly, their fur bristling as they stared at the corner of the room. "Who's there?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows pressing in around her. And then she heard it, a low, rasping breath coming from just behind her. She turned slowly, her flashlight revealing nothing. The room was empty, but she could feel it. A presence. Something watching her, just out of sight. The last thing she remembered was the flashlight flickering and the sound of her own scream as the darkness swallowed her. When her parents returned the next morning, they found the house in disarray. The doors were wide open, the snowstorm having coated the floors in a thin layer of ice. Lily was nowhere to be found. The only sign of her was the flashlight lying on the floor, its beam pointing toward the corner of the room where the snow had melted into the shape of a single wet footprint. Story the end.